Yesterday we talked about multicellularity, and that you have to have specialization in order to be a true multicellular organism. Right? And we looked at the plant as an example of that. We looked at all the layers of the leaf. Okay? We looked at how they each have a different job, how the cells on the top and bottom are the epidermal cells, and that they secrete a cuticle, okay, that prevents evaporation, that there's those stomates made of the guard cells that can change their shape to open and close and control evaporation, the palisade layer that does photosynthesis, the spongy layer that helps with gas exchange. They're all specialized. They all do a certain job. Right? We're going to keep going kind of with that idea, looking at basically now how does a plant transport water and materials. Okay? It's got lots of specialized cells and tissues that aid in that process. We're also going to be going back and looking at some of our cell transport processes now being used on a larger scale. Okay, especially osmosis. That'll be the most important one because plants use that almost primarily to help transport water up the plant. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how that gets incorporated on the scale of a whole organism today. Okay, so we got to look at how transport within cells is similar and involved with transport in a multicellular organism. Okay, so large scale. How nutrients, water, sugar, and minerals are transported in vascular plants. There's always several questions on the unit exam and usually one on the final. Okay, to do with that in the kind of written response. Structure of vascular plants. We looked kind of briefly at the leaf yesterday. We'll look at the plant as a whole today. Okay, and look at what forces are involved in transporting water and nutrients within the plant. Okay, so those are things to watch out for as we go along today. Okay, the big issue for a plant is acquiring the resources it needs. I mean, that's the challenge for any living organism, acquiring the resources it needs. But for a plant, the real problem is the resources it needs are not all in the same place. Okay? For animals, we eat food. Food's always in the same place. When I get it, I got it. Okay? That's what I ate. That's where all my energy was, all my nutrients were. Okay? It's not so much of a worry for us. But for plants, they have to have light to carry out photosynthesis, but there's no light underground. There's only light above ground. They also need water and nutrients, which are underground where there's no light. Okay? The parts of the plant that need water and nutrients are the parts that don't have access to it. The parts that need light are the parts that don't have access to it. So they've got to have a way to transport the materials back and forth between them in order to survive. Okay? There's lots of different adaptations for that, okay? And adaptations for acquiring and storing other resources that a plant either needs or produces for itself. Most plants can produce more energy than they actually require to survive, okay? Or at least to live at any given moment. So they have to have some way of storing that energy. Okay? There's different methods that plants have taken in doing that as well. Right? Some plants, they'll exhaust the water and nutrients and whatever in a specific area very quickly. Okay? Strawberries are an example of that. Okay? Strawberries, because they produce fruit, and any plants that produce fruit require lots of water and nutrients because that's what's in fruit. Okay, so they can exhaust the water and nutrients in an area fairly fast. The way that that strawberries have adapted to that problem is once they mature, they start growing these little kind of creeper kind of things, little roots or stems that don't have any photosynthetic ability. What they do is they stretch over to other pieces of soil, and when they touch them, they grow a whole new plant. So they'll grow a root system, okay, their own independent root system and another series of shoots and leaves that will start carrying out photosynthesis over there, but that is attached by a tube to the original plant. And through that tube, water and nutrients can be transported back to the original part of the plant. And so they creep and spread, okay, kind of along the ground. Raspberries do the same thing. If you have raspberries in your yard, you know that they come up everywhere. Okay, you plant them in one spot, but they'll start coming up in different parts of the yard because they just grow underneath the soil and pop up in a new spot. Okay, so that's how they've adapted sort of to, once I've used up everything in this spot, I can either die or think of another way to survive, and this is what they've done. Okay, other plants, they'll produce a whole bunch of energy when conditions are good, and they'll store whatever they have in excess. And then when conditions are not as good, maybe it's shorter days, or it's a rainy season, so there's not as much light and they don't photosynthesize as much, or maybe it's a long, hot, dry season where they just go dormant. Okay, they store energy for those times. Okay, and so they'll store it usually underground in either a rhizome or a tuber, otherwise known as a potato. Okay, okay? Potatoes are energy storage for plants, for potato plants in particular. Okay, that's why potatoes have tons of energy, tons of carbohydrates. They're full of starch. All right, so if you're looking for something that's got lots of energy, you want to eat things that have starch: pasta, rice, potatoes. Okay, those all have lots and lots of carbohydrates and lots of energy. Those are also the first thing that you knock off the list if you're trying to lose weight. Okay, because they have tons and tons of energy in them. All right, French fries are one of the worst things because you take the most energy dense plant material there is and boil it in animal fat, which also has tons and tons of energy, because what is animal fat? Energy storage for animals. Okay, potatoes are like plant fat. Okay, that's where they store their excess energy. Okay, now the nice thing about potatoes is these can grow into new plants the following season, because obviously potatoes grow in climates where there's going to be a long, hard winter, okay, or at least hard enough that it'll kill the foliage. They'll grow from the plants the next season. How many of you have ever planted potatoes before? Okay, or seen The Martian, okay, where he plants the potatoes, right? That's exactly how you plant potatoes. You cut them in half, okay, and you put them face down in the ground, okay, and the little eyes will grow into new plants. All right. If you've ever left any by accident in your pantry, okay, you may find a creature in there later. Okay, I know I once did this in my basement. I had harvested some potatoes from my garden, and I had them in the basement. I forgot about them, and I went downstairs, and it looked like there was a big, giant, purplish spider, okay, in my basement, because it had grown these little sprouts trying to find some sunlight and soil to live in. Okay, and it had so much energy stored in that potato that the sprouts were a good 2 feet long. Okay, all of them from one potato. Right? Because what is it doing? It's using the energy stored in the potato to get the plant started. If it can get light, then it can carry out photosynthesis. If it can get to soil where it can get nutrients, it can get water and nutrients, and then the plant will survive. Unfortunately, the one in the basement was doomed, of course, because it's not going to grow roots through the concrete of the basement floor, and it's not going to find any light in the basement either. Right? So it gets these purpley long things with purple leaves on them that don't do anything until the potato is shriveled up to nothing. Nick, you had a question? Oh, it was probably 4 months. Yeah, something like that. It was several months. Yeah, I seem to remember it being kind of in the dead of winter when I discovered it in the basement. So, yeah, okay. It takes a while, but that's their energy storage, right? It's a way to survive to the next season. Sure, this part of the plant isn't going to survive, but that's okay. It can grow from this part. It's stored enough energy there to do that. Okay, now, obviously things with starch in them are a little bit more bitter, okay? But there's also other ways to store energy, and that is in the base of the leaves. So things like onions, okay? Onions tend to be a little sweeter because they don't store it as starch, they store the energy as sugar, right? And so that gets stored at the base of the leaves. And then if you've ever planted onions, this is what you plant, okay? You plant the bulb from the previous season, okay? Put it in the ground, and it'll grow right from there because there's enough energy stored in the bulb. Okay, to get it going, get a shoot system above ground and a root system below ground, and get it moving. Okay. All right. So the body of a vascular plant has obviously a subterranean root system. Subterranean means underground. Okay, that absorbs water and minerals, and an aerial shoot system, okay, of leaves that's responsible for carrying out photosynthesis. And then, of course, in between those two is your vascular system. Okay, within the stem are the vascular tissues of the xylem and phloem that transport water and sugar. Okay, making sense. So the challenge of a plant is the things it needs are not in the same place. So there's got to be a way to transport them from where they are to where they are needed. Okay, so one of the ways that plants do this, okay, or one of the ways that plants acquire their resources is to get tall. Okay? If you're tall, what can you get more of? Sunlight. Okay? You see this if you've ever been in a tropical rainforest, okay, or you've even been in a temperate rainforest, like out to BC where the giant redwoods are, the big cedars and stuff. Okay, those get really, really tall. The reason they get tall? To get sunlight, shade out their competition. Okay? Believe it or not, plants are competing all the time. Okay? If you can get bigger leaves and shade out your competition, they die, you live, you get all the resources. It's a harsh world out there. Okay? That's how natural selection works. Okay? In order to get tall, plants have to have certain adaptations. Not all plants have the ability to get really tall. Okay, these plants here, they have no ability to get tall. That's why they droop like this. Okay, they don't have this stuff called lignin. Okay, lignin is a material that is produced by the cell walls of cells of certain types of plants. Okay, lignin acts like cement. Okay, and what it does is it cements the cell walls of other cells together. Just like if you were laying bricks, you would put mortar, okay, cement, in between them to cement them together. Okay, that's why bricks have holes in the middle, if you've ever seen bricks. Okay, they have holes in the middle so that the mortar gets inside each brick, and then when it solidifies, it's not two bricks anymore. It's one solid piece of rock. Okay, that makes it sturdier. Well, lignin does the same thing with cell walls. It cements the cell walls together and makes them even more rigid than they were before. Okay, that's what makes wood. Okay, that's what makes a tree have an actual trunk. Okay, so if you look at these little like ficus plants here, okay, they have bark. Okay, there's like a hard stem here that allows them to grow vertically upward, where these are crawlers. Okay, over here we got we've got the dragon palm, which is the tall one here. Okay, okay, palm trees, they secrete a lot of lignin. Okay. Their advantage is their lignin is actually a lot more flexible than most other ones, which is why if you've ever watched like videos of a hurricane, you see palm trees swinging back and forth, and they seem to oscillate like 20 or 30 feet, okay? But they don't snap, okay? A tree here, you get it oscillating about 4 or 5 feet, and it snaps off, okay? The trees here they're not as flexible, okay? These things here, these plants here, they produce a little bit of lignin, but not very much, which is why they're all supported by sticks, okay? They can only get so tall before they just fall over. All right? The more lignin you can produce, the taller you can get, or the better you can protect your seeds. Okay? If you've ever eaten like a chestnut or a walnut or something like that, you crack the shell, it's still made of the same stuff, okay, that a tree trunk is made out of. Hard, protects the seed inside. Okay, right, so lignin, that's something you should definitely know about. Okay, functions in support. Lignin is a major advantage for plants that possess it. All right, other ways to support a plant. Turgor pressure. We talked about that term before. Right, that's the support that's provided by the water vacuole. If the water vacuole is full, it pushes everything in the cell against the cell wall and makes the cell rigid. Okay? If the plant starts to become dehydrated, water leaves the fluid kind of leaves the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm will become saltier, okay, as water moves by osmosis out of the plant cell through the membrane. Well, if you've got water moving out of the cell, then water will start to move out of the vacuole and into the cytoplasm by exactly the same process, by osmosis. It gets drawn out and there's nothing the plant can do about it. Okay? As the water vacuole gets drained, okay, so we can see in this picture here, and it's not that a plant cell has like one vacuole, it usually has more than one. Okay? We can see the 3 vacuoles here are quite full, the plant is upright. Okay? As those begin to get drained, we can see that the plant is having less of an ability to support its own mass. Okay? And then eventually, when the vacuoles get drained enough, the cell membrane will actually pull away from the cell wall and cause the total wilting, okay, of the plant. Okay? It'll get to this step here. Unfortunately, I watered all of my plants a couple weeks ago, so I took pictures of them when they were awful, okay, when they were really, really wilty. That's that green plant there, okay, when it was really dry. Okay, and you can see that the leaves are all curled, okay, limp looking. All right, same with the one in the beige container there. Okay, you can see here that it's all curled and wilted and weak and limp looking. Okay, but now, I mean, look how upright these leaves are. Okay, they're not hanging or sagging or anything like that. They're all very upright and full because the vacuoles are all full. They're well supplied with water. Okay, so can you bring a plant back from the brink? Yes. Okay. If it's crunchy, you might be a little late. Okay. That's kind of the general rule. Once a plant is crunchy, it's a little late to save it. Okay. Some plants can come back from that, but okay, most of the time they still got to be at least a little bit green if you're going to have any hope. All right. So Turgor pressure. Okay. Make sure you understand that that's pressure of water in the vacuoles. Okay. And it will contribute to the support of small plants. okay, but not like a large tree. Okay? A large tree would not be able to support that kind of weight just on Turgor pressure. All right, questions on that? All right, parts of the plant. Start at the bottom. Plants have got to have roots. Okay? Roots serve several functions. Obviously, the biggest function that roots serve is to acquire water and nutrients. Okay? But another function of the roots is to anchor the plant to the ground. Plants could be tipped over if they don't have a good, strong root system. And we see that sometimes when we get like a big windstorm and some of the trees either get knocked right over, like completely uprooted, okay, or they get just snapped off. The ones that get snapped off are the ones that had really good roots. Okay? They had so much roots that they couldn't pull them out. Right? And the tree eventually gave somewhere else. Okay? When we had the flood back in 2013, we saw a lot more trees not so much knocked over as uprooted, pulled right out of the ground because the water eroded the soil that their roots were holding onto. Okay? That's why roots have that characteristic kind of root shape to them. They kind of go everywhere. Okay? The more little small roots you have, the more surface area there is to hold onto. And so the more supported you're going to be. Having just a couple of really big roots is not going to make you well anchored to the ground. Having many small ones is better. That's why you never see grass get picked up and thrown. Okay? Living grass never gets picked up and uprooted by wind. Okay? It's got tiny little roots and obviously not much above the ground to catch the wind. Okay? But with a big tree, if we got lots of smaller roots, we're much better off. Right? So there's two types of root systems. A taproot and fibrous roots. Okay? So these are fibrous here. And this is a taproot. Okay? A taproot is a single deep root with maybe a few little root hairs coming off of it. Okay? A carrot is a taproot. All right? A turnip, a beet, those are taproots. Dandelions have taproots. If you've ever pulled up a dandelion, it's got that long white root underneath. Okay? It may have a few other ones, but it usually has one central long root. Okay? Thistle, Canada thistle also has a deep, very deep taproot, in fact. Okay? I used to work at a golf course when I was in high school and university, and I was always going out and spraying things and or pulling up weeds. If you pulled up a Canada thistle and the root was broken off, you were going to come back, because if you miss any part of the root, it'll grow again. It'll grow from that part of the root and it'll grow up again. Okay? And sometimes those could have roots that were deeper in the ground than the plant was tall above it. Okay? Dandelions are similar to that. Dandelions often have a deeper root than they are tall above the ground. Okay? That anchors them very well. Okay? If they were to be grazed on by an animal, which of course happens, okay? Cows or deer or whatever come along and eat them, they've got a lot of energy stored below. They regrow the foliage. They grow again. Okay? Does that sort of make sense? Right? There isn't a real advantage of one over the other. Okay? It's very situational. You'll find in the desert, which one do you think would be most common in the desert? Actually, there's some of both. Okay? If you are a saguaro cactus, like the ones on the Taco Time sign, right? Okay, with the arms, they have a fibrous root system, not a taproot. And the fibrous root system goes down into the ground about maybe at the most about 6 inches. Okay? Because what good does it do to have a deep taproot in a place that never gets rain anyway? It's close to the surface so that when it does rain, it can grab the water before it evaporates. Water in the desert is not going to have a chance to soak into the ground. Okay? It's going to be dried all the way down. Now, that said, there are some plants that do have deep taproots in the desert, but they're ones that grow in places where there's an aquifer or a well. They can actually grow deep enough that they'll catch groundwater, okay, and grow from there. Mesquite is an example of that. Okay? So it's all depending on kind of the situation as to what kind of root you're going to have. And you could have two plants side by side in the same environment that have different root systems. Okay? Grass, fibrous roots. Beans, fibrous roots. Okay? In fact, these are the roots of a bean plant. Right? Taproots, okay? Like we said, carrots and turnips and things like that. Advantages of a taproot: they can store energy, a lot of it. Okay, that's why we eat lots of plants that are roots, carrots and beets and turnips and things like that. Okay, they store a lot of energy in the roots. Okay, fibrous roots give you more surface area to acquire water. and they tend to anchor you down a little better than a taproot. Okay? If you have a taproot and there's a strong wind, if the top of the plant starts to sway, the ground acts like a pivot point, okay, or a fulcrum. And as the top sways, the bottom will pivot as well. And you can actually work a taproot right out of the ground by moving it around and starting to rotate it and just pull it right out. Okay? Fibrous root, that's a lot tougher to do, right? Because it's gripping everywhere, right? Fibrous roots also oftentimes have little nodules on them that you don't see on a taproot, and those nodules contain bacteria. Now you might be thinking, well, that's not good. Bacteria make you sick. Some do. But some bacteria are helpful. And in the case of these bacteria take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Okay? Our atmosphere is actually 80% nitrogen. Okay? They take it out of the atmosphere and they turn it into nitrates, which is fertilizer that plants need. Okay? So they can actually take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into food for the plant, okay? Just through their action. That's very advantageous. And in fact, that's why farmers that are growing food organically will typically rotate, well, I mean, all farmers tend to rotate their crop, but it's especially important if you grow organically. That means you don't add any fertilizer ever. So what they'll do is they'll grow a crop one year that takes a lot of stuff out of the soil, and then the next year they'll grow like field beans or field peas on that area because their roots have these on them, and they actually put nitrogen back into the soil so that the next year they can grow something that'll take more out. And if they just keep rotating, their soil doesn't become depleted. Okay? If you were to, let's say, grow canola, okay, which is like the most nutrient-intensive crop there is, if you grew that year after year after year, you would just have to fertilize the heck out of that area. Okay? You would constantly be adding fertilizers to that area because it just gobbles up stuff. Okay? And of course, when you harvest it, what's left behind? Just the roots, right? So if you've had a crop like canola that takes stuff out of the soil, okay, and then you harvest the crop, well, you took everything that was in the soil, took it away. That was the crop. Whereas if you had beans like this, you still got a crop, you got the beans, but you also got the roots staying there, and when they decompose, they'll release all of that nitrogen back into the soil. Okay? All right, so roots are an anchor, okay, and they absorb minerals and water. Okay, there's an advantage and a disadvantage to each type of roots. Okay, it's just a matter of kind of which one has been adapted. All right, now for surface area, for absorption, surface area is important. The more surface area you have, the more stuff you can absorb. Okay, to increase surface area on a taproot, you'll see little root hairs. If you've ever pulled up a carrot, okay, you know it's got the little white, little hairy looking things that come off of it. Those are the root hairs. Okay, that's what's helping it to increase the surface area to absorb water. Okay, typically things with a taproot don't have a lot of foliage above the ground, so they don't actually require a whole lot of water. Okay? If you look at a carrot, it's just got, you know, the tiny little sprigs of leaves above the ground. Okay, same with like a turnip or a beet. Okay, whereas with peas and beans and things like that, there's a lot of above ground growth. All right, the stems. Okay, main purposes of the stems is to support the plant and transport nutrients from the roots to the leaves. Okay, that is their main job. They carry out very little photosynthesis compared to the actual leafy parts of the plant. Okay, and depending on what kind of plant it is, there's either going to be plants or cells specialized to exert lots of Turgor pressure, or cells specialized to secrete a lot of lignin, one or the other, depending on what kind of a plant it is. Okay, other part of the job of the stem is to direct the growth of the plant. And I'm not saying that it's making like conscious decisions and saying, okay, you got to grow over that way, you got to grow over this way. Okay, but direction of growth is determined by several things, which we'll talk about later. Okay, but typically it's determined by sunlight, gravity, and touch. Those are the three things that a plant responds to in terms of its direction of growth. Okay, which one would be the first and foremost one that would respond? Yeah, sunlight is its food. It's going to grow, okay, towards sunlight above all other things. If a plant gets grazed on, which happens, okay, something comes along and eats it, it's got to grow back. But it can't grow from the part that gets cut off. Okay, so we've got this plant here, and it gets grazed on, and this gets chewed off. Right? So we got the stump right here. Okay? The only place it can't grow from that stump. There are no stem cells there. We talked about those the other day. The stem cells are in the buds. Right? So it's going to grow from those buds. It'll replace the lost foliage by growing from the buds next down on the plant. Okay? Arborists and gardeners use this all the time. Anyone have a hedge around their yard? Okay, the cemetery over on Big Rock there by the Ford dealership and by Big Rock Elementary School, they've got a hedge all the way around that, right? And every year they come in and they trim it. What's the purpose of trimming it? Well, it does get a little bit wild, but the more you trim a hedge, the thicker it gets. If they didn't trim those carriganas, they would just grow upwards. They would grow towards the sun. Okay? But by cutting them off every year, you're forcing them to grow from a point further back. So instead of having just one long stringy thing, they've now got two. And the next year, if I cut those off, I'll get even more growth. Okay? And I get this full, thick looking plant as opposed to a long, stringy looking plant. Okay? By nature, most plants grow long and stringy because they want to get tall and get to the light. But we can alter that by essentially cutting pieces off. Okay? The more you cut your grass, the fuller it's going to look, okay? Because you're forcing it to grow from further down. Everyone follow on that? Okay? So the stem determines a lot of where the growth is going to be. Okay? And that comes always from buds that are further down. All right, leaves. Obviously the leaves are the photosynthetic organ of the plant. Okay? So they carry out photosynthesis. Okay? And this is probably the best diagram. I think you have this one, right? In your notes? Okay, so this is your best diagram of the leaf. Okay, I showed you a couple yesterday, but this is kind of the best one. Okay, so we've got the cuticle on the top. Okay, and the cuticle is secreted by the upper epidermis. So the cuticle actually isn't cells. The cuticle is just a layer of wax that these cells produce. So again, the focus here is cells specialized to do a certain job. The epidermal cells are specialized to secrete the cuticle. They carry out next to no photosynthesis. Right? If they did, they'd be full of chloroplasts and none of the light would get down to the parts of the leaf that are supposed to carry out photosynthesis. So they are, by their nature, pretty clear. Okay? Below the upper epidermis is that palisade layer. I'm not worried about whether you know this word or not. Okay, so don't worry about the word mesophyll. Palisade layer and spongy layer will be fine. Okay, so the palisade layer, those cells are packed in really, really tight. They have tons and tons of chloroplasts. Their job is to carry out photosynthesis as much as possible. In order to do that, they need certain raw materials. They're getting sunlight from above, but they need water and carbon dioxide. That comes from the stomates. Carbon dioxide comes in through there, okay? And the water comes in through the veins. Right? So water moves by osmosis out of the veins and into these cells. Okay? The reason it works by osmosis is, well, as these things use up water, they get saltier. Okay? And so as a result, water gets drawn out this way. Okay? Water also gets drawn out through the stomates because when these are using up water, it evaporates. Okay? The water evaporates and it goes out of the stomates. Okay? That's what essentially causes photosynthesis to occur. So the cells in this layer, in the spongy layer, have no determined or fixed shape. That creates these big spaces, just like a sponge. Okay? The kind of bubbles in a sponge, okay, that can hold water, okay, and carbon dioxide and oxygen as well. Okay? These things are going to produce oxygen as a waste product. They don't want it to stay there. Okay? Oxygen will move out of these cells where it's highly concentrated by diffusion out to the stomates and into the open air. Right? So there's some diffusion going on, there's some osmosis going on. All of that works together to move things where they need to go. Okay? What's the other thing that these cells are going to produce? They're going to produce oxygen, but they're also going to produce? Nope. They take in CO2. Sugar. Yeah, they're going to make sugar. Well, the sugar is going to go into these cells right here, and that's going to shoot down to the roots, okay, or the other non-photosynthetic parts of the plant. All right, general kind of leaf shape. You generally have a shape kind of like a spade. Okay, you've got the blade. Okay, that's where most of the photosynthesis is going to go. You're going to have the stalk. And then where the leaf joins the rest of the plant right here is called the petiole. P-E-T-I-O-L-E. Okay, blade, stalk, and petiole. Okay, so when we look at this, we're actually looking at the blade part of the leaf. Okay, so we talked about the spongy layer, we talked about the stomates and the guard cells yesterday. Again, specialized cells that help control the amount of evaporation that occurs from the plant. Okay, lower epidermis is there to secrete a cuticle that seals the bottom of the leaf and keeps evaporation from occurring over the whole plant. It only allows it to occur out the stomates, which greatly reduces the amount of water lost by a plant. Okay, the cuticle and the stomate were the two most important adaptations, evolutionarily speaking, for plants to move to land. Okay? The first plants that moved onto land would have been like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, things like that, that are very succulent, okay? Which means they don't have a cuticle, they don't have vascular tissue, right? And so if you get them in direct sunlight, they just dry up. Okay? So they would have kind of grown around the edges of lakes and rivers and things like that in the ocean, where there was always a source of water. But to colonize further inland required a way to save water, okay, as well as a way to acquire water. A moss doesn't have roots, okay? It just sits on the surface and hopes that it's wet enough to stay alive. All right, transport in plants. You've got this diagram, okay, and I think you got a list of all the steps here. So follow along. I'm just going to go through the steps on the diagram. You have the steps just below it, I think. Okay, so we'll start down here. Step number one. Step number one, we got to get water into the roots. Okay, how do the roots do that? Well, they've got to set up an osmotic gradient. Okay, that is, they've got to have a way to make water want to move into them. Right? So typically what they'll do is, as they're transporting water up the plant, that creates a salt imbalance in the roots. Okay, water moves into the roots. Okay, once that's occurred, now we've got water within the tissue of the plant. Okay, how do I force it up the plant? What's that? Yeah, but it's osmotic pressure from above. It isn't a pressure from below. Okay? There's always this idea that roots somehow pump water up the plant. If you've ever looked at roots, they're not doing this. Okay? They're not pumping anything. Okay? What's causing the water to move up is that water is evaporating up here. When water evaporates here, okay, it's water that's been absorbed from the soil. It's full of salt and nutrients. When it evaporates, the salt and nutrients are left in the spongy layer of the leaf. So as a result, water is pulled out of the tubes and into the spongy layer by osmosis. Because water's polar, those water molecules are hooked together by cohesion. So when one of them moves, it pulls on the rest. Okay, just like a barrel of monkeys. We talked about that back in the chemistry unit. Okay, they're all linked like that. If I pull on the top one, I pull all of them. Okay? And so as they move up and out of the stomates, they pull on all the rest, and that pulls them up through the stem. It requires no energy. Plants, including really tall trees, can transport water sometimes hundreds of meters using no energy whatsoever. Okay? Because it's using osmosis, and osmosis is passive, it's free. Okay? That's good and fine as long as conditions support it. If you start getting a salt buildup in the soil, is this process going to work very well? No. That's why plants will start to get sick if it's been dry for too long. It's not that there isn't water still in the soil. There is. But there's too much other stuff there, and they're not able to create that osmotic pulling force because they're not able to create an imbalance that starts at the top of the tree. Okay? If you've ever seen what happens when a slough dries up, okay, what gets left behind is that kind of white salt flat, and almost nothing grows in there. Okay? The plants that grow near the edge always get sick, okay, because there's so much salt in that top layer of the soil that they can't pull the water out of it, even though there's plenty of water there. Okay? There's just too much salt for them to make that work. Okay? So it's fine as long as you've got a constant replenishment of water. If it rains, okay, then there'll be more water and there'll be less salt concentration. Doesn't mean there's less salt, it just means it's less concentrated, and we can get this osmotic imbalance working for us. Okay? If we don't get a lot of rain, Don't have a lot of moisture, we won't be able to create that imbalance. And in fact, it can become critical if the imbalance is down here, because then osmosis will work in reverse. It'll actually start pulling moisture out of the leaves and down the plant. Okay, gets to that point and you're in trouble. Okay, so one is pulling in the water. Okay, number two over here is showing cellular respiration. That is the roots using the sugar produced by the leaves, okay, for energy. So they're taking in oxygen and they're giving off carbon dioxide. The roots don't carry out photosynthesis, they carry out cellular respiration. All cells in a plant do, okay, but it's all the roots do because they can't carry out photosynthesis for themselves. So they burn the sugar. That's process number two. Okay, process number three, water is moving up the stem of the plant in something called the xylem. Okay, the xylem are tubes near the middle of the stem. Okay, water moves in those. This is actually what the xylem looks like under an electron microscope. Okay, now remember, this is under an electron microscope. How big are these tubes? Tiny. Okay, this is 100 micrometers. Okay, so that distance there is 100 micrometers, which means each one of those tubes is maybe 5 to 7 microns across. They have to be small. The polar nature of water wouldn't support a column of water if the tubes were this big. Okay, there'd be too much weight in the middle that couldn't be supported by either adhesion to the side of the tube or cohesion from the surface tension in the water molecules. Okay, so the tubes have to be really small, but there's lots of them. Okay, and that allows for, if the osmosis isn't working, okay, for the water to stay kind of stationary within the tubes. Because overnight, how much water is a plant going to transport? Not much. Okay, there's not a lot of evaporation happening overnight because there's no sun, there's no photosynthesis going on, so the process is all kind of stall. We wouldn't want all the water to just fall back down to the roots overnight. Okay, so there's got to be those small tubes kind of holding that there. Okay, step number 4, water evaporates out of those stomates. Okay, that leaves the salts behind that creates the osmotic pulling force that will pull everything back up. Okay, so water has to evaporate for water to be transported. Okay, if it can't evaporate, then it can't transport water. Okay, step number 5, exchange of gases for photosynthesis. Taking in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, okay, light coming into there, creating sugar. Okay, so steps 5 and 6 are essentially the gas exchange and energy input that causes photosynthesis to occur. Once the sugar is produced, it moves down the stem in a different set of tubes. Why can I not have sugar and water in the same tubes? Well, not just that. Water's moving up, sugar's moving down. You can't, it's like having opposing traffic in the same lane. Okay, it's not going to work out. Right? So there's a separate set of tubes for the sugar called the phloem. The phloem is near the outside of the stem. Okay, that's why if you nick a tree or something's been chewing on it, the sticky sap comes out, right? Because those are the things, that's what they're looking for. They're chewing on the edge of the tree, trying to get at the sticky sap. They couldn't care less about the xylem sap that's in the middle, because it's basically just water. Okay? They want the stuff that's got the sugar in it. And that's what deer do over the winter. They chew on poplar trees, okay, eat the bark off, because the bark is soaked essentially on the inside with the sugary sap from the previous season. Okay? Now, if something interrupts the flow of sugar, okay, which is step 7 here, flow of sugar down, okay, if something interrupts that flow, what's going to happen to the plant? It's going to die. Okay? We had this happen when I was in university. We had this nice field behind our dorm where we would go play football or baseball or whatever on nice days, and they one day decided, the faculty of forestry decided they were going to transplant these trees that they had rescued from somewhere into our field. Well, we didn't like that very much because it's much harder to play baseball and football in the trees. Okay? Well, we had a guy in our dorm who his nickname was Tree Mugger. He was in forestry. He said, well, we can get rid of those. And we're like, come on, we can't go out there with a chainsaw. We'll get caught. Okay? If we go out there with a chainsaw and cut them down, they're going to know who did it. Said, no, we don't have to cut them down. We'll just ring them. What does that mean? Pulls out this piece of cable, goes up to a tree, and just starts pulling it back and forth, walking around the tree like this, pulling it around and around until he had chewed through the bark about that far all the way around. Sap starts leaking out of this tree. Okay? So, no sap, no sugar is now getting to the roots of this tree. So the roots starve, and the tree starts to die. Starts to die. Unfortunately for us, fortunately for the trees, the Department of Forestry took on another tree rescue. No, they made paper mache trunk grafts. Okay, so paper mache is made from paper, which is made from pulp from destroyed trees. So what they did is they made this paper mache and they grafted it over the spots we'd ring the trees. Okay, and of course it hardened and essentially replaced and sealed the phloem so that sap could once again run to the roots. Okay, for 2 years afterwards, you could still see the comics in the trunk as the tree grew right over the graft. Okay? It eventually grew like kind of chunky material right over top of this paper mache. Right? So in the end, we lost our field anyway after all that work. It actually got in the like university newspaper that people had gone out and vandalized the trees, and they were looking for these people, and were like, "Oh, we don't know anything about it." Okay? Yeah. But okay, that's what happens if you get all of the phloem of a tree disrupted. It'll starve the roots. Okay? It's not that the rest of the tree isn't working; the roots starve. Okay? Okay, so that's what we just went over there, guys, so I won't bother kind of going over this again. We've already talked about those steps. Carson. Like overwatering? Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like you can, well, we didn't have access to a lot of chemicals. We were university students, yeah. We were too poor, you know. If you go out there and spray a big tree with like Killex, you know, it's not going to hurt the tree because you can't reach the leaves. You're just going to inhale a bunch of Killex, and that's not good for you either. Okay. Yeah. So yes, you can poison plants by adding stuff to the water. Okay. Like I had a plant that for the longest time took all kinds of abuse until it finally died, but I'd pour coffee on the thing. Like my cold coffee at the end of the day, I'd just throw it in and then it kept growing, whatever. It didn't seem to affect it. And then I can't remember what it was that got spilled on it, and then it got into the soil and died. But okay. Yeah, I mean, if you watered a plant with bleach, that would do it. Yeah. What's that? Well, yeah. Yeah, if you put, in the water, because the water gets up into the petals and changes the color, yeah. Okay, so the two tissues most involved, okay, in transporting material in plants, phloem and xylem. Got to know those, okay? Got to be able to tell me what they transport and which direction, okay? So the xylem transports water up the plant using osmosis and the polar nature of water. Okay? The phloem transports sugar using gravity. Yeah. Always do it the way that's free. Okay? It requires no energy to transport using osmosis and the polar nature of water. It requires no energy to use gravity to transport things downwards. Okay? So again, the plant is transporting water essentially for free. Okay. So we said the phloem is near the outside. Okay? That's why we ringed those trees. Okay? We didn't have to cut the trees down completely. We only had to get in far enough to break the phloem. This is incidentally also the part of a tree that is punctured if you're trying to harvest maple syrup. Okay, so if you're looking at a maple tree, okay, you know, we have this idea that they punch these taps into the tree, but we don't really know how far in they go because we never see that part. They don't go in very far. Okay, if they go into here, you're going to have watery syrup. Like basically, it's going to be water. That's not good. Okay, we only want it to go in about this far so it captures the sugary sap that's running to the roots. Okay. Also, don't get the idea that once you punch that thing into the tree, you can just open the tap and maple syrup pours out, okay? It's like drip, drip, drip. That's why real maple syrup is really expensive, okay? Like to get like a half a liter of maple syrup is like 10 or 12 bucks, okay? Whereas you can buy Aunt Jemima for like 3, okay? All right, and then the xylem, like we said, is closer to the inside. Listen in here, guys. Xylem tubes are actually dead phloem tubes. Because a tree grows by adding layers to the outside. It doesn't grow from the inside. If a tree grew by adding layers to the inside, it would always crack. Okay? It doesn't. It grows by adding layers to the outside, which is why, of course, when you cut down a tree, you can see the rings. The rings represent where the outside of the tree was each year. Each year it puts on another layer and grows outwards, outwards, outwards. Okay? And they can do a lot of, people are doing a lot of like climatology studies. When they cut down really old trees that are like 1,000 years old, okay, they can look at the ring pattern within the tree and draw from that conclusions on how warm, cold, dry, or wet the climate was during certain parts of that tree's life. If it was cold and dry, you're going to get a very small ring. Okay? If it was a really good growing conditions, it was hot and they got lots of rain, then you get a really big jump. One ring will be much wider than the ones before it. Okay? And so they can use that to tell, okay, before we started keeping records, okay, like 200 or 300 years ago, this is what the climate was like. We can tell that based on these trees' growth, and then we can say, okay, now looking at more modern stuff, how does that compare? What are the trends in our climate? So a lot of our climatology is coming from study of trees we've cut down. All right. So the xylem transports water up the plant. Yep, definitely got to know that. Okay, it's located near the center of the tree. Okay, and it is accomplished with osmosis, adhesion, and cohesion of water molecules. So put a star on that paragraph because that's certainly one you're going to need to be able to regurgitate for me later. All right, so in cooperation, those three processes move water to the top of the tree. Water evaporates from the top of the tree. Okay, the remaining solution in the xylem becomes more concentrated, more salty. Okay, and water is pulled up from the roots to balance that concentration. On its way up, it hydrogen bonds to itself in cohesion, hydrogen bonds to the inside of the xylem in adhesion. Okay, and the water moves its way slowly up the xylem tubes. Okay, questions on that? All right. For the phloem, process is much simpler. Sugar gets in the phloem and flows downhill. Okay, gravity just makes it go. All right, so it's pretty convenient that way. Now, we said yesterday that within the phloem are these little sieve plates. Okay, specialized cells that kind of have holes in them but act as a stopper. Okay, and the reason for that is we don't want big crystals of sugar to form in the sap because they could block the tube. So if we have these sieve plates and there are crystals forming, the crystals catch on the sieve plates and the weight of the sap above crushes the crystal and allows the smaller pieces to get through and the sap to keep flowing. Right? Now, another thing that can change the viscosity, that's the thickness of the sap, is the fact that the phloem tubes are right next to the xylem tubes. If the phloem sap starts to get too thick, water will move by osmosis out of the xylem tubes and into the phloem tubes and make it runnier. Okay? Not all the time, but if it gets extreme, that's what will happen. All right. So phloem transports sugars, okay, down the plant by gravity. All right, I want you guys to answer those questions here. I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll go through them together. Okay, so let's have a look at these. What processes or properties are used in both intracellular transport and transport in multicellular organisms? Which two did we talk about today? Okay, cell transport processes. That's where they occur. That's where they occur. Okay. No, that's not a transport process. It is something the plant uses to support itself. What are the two transport processes that we talked about? Osmosis is a huge one. Okay, without osmosis, the plant is not moving water up the plant. Okay, so osmosis is a big one, but so is diffusion. Okay, if we go back to our diagram of the leaf here, okay, we said that stuff moves out of the xylem here, okay, and into these cells. Well, it does that by osmosis if it's water. Okay, but what about the other stuff? Well, there's gases that need to move from the atmosphere out here and into these cells. Like carbon dioxide needs to do that. Well, Carbon dioxide is low in concentration here and higher in concentration here. So it moves naturally that way by diffusion. And oxygen, which gets produced here, is high in concentration and moves out the stomates by exactly the same process. Right? So diffusion and osmosis are huge. Active transport, no. Okay? Active transport plays very little role on a big scale. Okay? It's good for moving things across a cell membrane, but not over large distances. Okay? It's just not going to work that well for that. Okay? So it's not involved. The two big ones are diffusion and osmosis. All right. If you were tapping a maple tree to harvest sap for syrup, which transporting tissue are you looking at? Phloem. That's where the sugary sap is. That's what you want. You don't want watery dirt water, okay, for your syrup. Okay, where is it located? Near the outside of the plant, right? Okay, in the leaf, why are so many cells packed together near the surface of the leaf? Right, we want the top side of the leaf to carry out more photosynthesis, so we pack a whole bunch of cells into what's that layer called? No, not the very top, but that layer that carries out all the photosynthesis starts with P. The cuticle is the waxy layer. I'm looking for the layer that does the photosynthesis. Palisade layer, right? Okay, so we're looking here at the palisade layer. Okay, and that is supplied with water through the xylem. The xylem branches out into little veins and veinlets that go into the individual parts of the leaf and supply the palisade layer with water. Okay, would a plant be able to transport water to its leaves more easily or less easily on a humid day? So if it's humid, what is there a lot of in the air? Water. Okay, so if it's really, really humid, how easy is it going to be for it to transport water? It's going to be harder. We're trying to get water to move from the leaves into the air, and there's already a lot of water there. So we have to set up an even greater differential in osmotic pressure in order to get water to transport, because not a lot of it is going to evaporate or not evaporate at the same rate. If it's a dry day, water evaporates really easy. Okay. All right, number 5, you have a plant that does not look very full, so it's only got a few stringy branches, okay, kind of like this one does. Okay, I used to, on this plant, trim it every once in a while, but I completely stopped doing that. Okay, you can see right here is where I stopped trimming it. Okay, since then, it's growing only a few long, stringy branches. Okay. I should trim it, or just wrap it around, do like a Donald Trump thing, okay, around the top of the plant there. Okay, so what do I need to do? And unfortunately, this doesn't work with hair. If you trim your hair, it does not grow faster. Trust me, I've tried. Okay, yeah, so you need to trim the plant because then it'll grow from the buds that are further back, and that'll make it have a more full outer appearance, more branches, okay, with a fuller appearance than less branches with stringy long branches. Okay. All right, questions on any of those? Okay.